What if the greatest secret you ever discovered was never meant to belong to you? What if protecting that secret meant choosing friendship over fame, wonder over wealth, and trust over curiosity? For Seymour, the mysterious creatures beneath the sea had become more than something extraordinary. They had become his friends. But now Seymour would discover that the greatest gift they could give him was not a pearl. It was trust. Hello everyone, and welcome to Dreamed Stories, where fictional stories are made for you, my listeners. Today's dreamed story is The Fisherman and the Hidden Sea. This is the final chapter. Let us begin. Summer slowly settled over Merrow Bay. The mornings grew warmer. The evenings stretched longer. Tourists from neighboring villages occasionally stopped by the market, hoping to purchase fresh seafood before continuing along the coast. To them, Merrow Bay was simply another peaceful fishing village. Few realized that beneath the calm waters surrounding the harbor rested one of the world's greatest secrets. And Seymour intended to keep it that way. Weeks passed peacefully. Each morning Seymour visited the sanctuary. Each afternoon he returned with ordinary catches of fish and clams. He was careful never to sell the extraordinary pearls the guardians had gifted him. Those remained safely stored inside a carved wooden chest beneath his bed. They were no longer treasures. They were memories, proof of a friendship. Nothing more. The guardians seemed happier than ever. The younger ones had grown especially fond of Seymour. As soon as he entered the sanctuary, several would rush toward him, circling around his diving fins before darting away in playful zigzag movements. One tiny guardian had even developed a favorite game. It loved collecting brightly colored seashells. Every morning, it proudly presented Seymour with whichever shell it considered the prettiest. Sometimes it was pink, sometimes blue, sometimes perfectly white. Seymour always accepted the shell with exaggerated excitement. The tiny guardian would immediately begin its cheerful dance, causing several others to join in. Watching them laugh, if laughter could exist without sound, always reminded Seymour why the sanctuary deserved protecting. And Seymour was beginning to understand something. The guardians had never needed a fisherman. They had never needed someone to discover them. What they needed was someone who would leave them in peace. One afternoon, something unexpected happened. As Seymour explored a coral garden with several young guardians, he noticed one of them struggling. A very small guardian had become tangled in a length of old fishing line wrapped around a coral branch. It was not hurt, but every attempt to swim free only tightened the line. The little guardian became increasingly frightened. The others circled anxiously nearby. Seymour remained calm. "It is all right." He slowly approached, keeping his movements gentle. The frightened guardian froze. Its transparent body shimmered nervously. Seymour carefully reached into a small pouch attached to his diving belt. Inside was a simple safety knife used for cutting rope in emergencies. He slowly sliced through the fishing line. The moment it loosened, the tiny guardian floated free. For several seconds, it remained perfectly still. Then it cautiously approached Seymour. Its transparent body gently brushed against his shoulder. A warm sensation spread through him once again. The little guardian quickly zigzagged through the water before disappearing behind several larger guardians, almost as though it were embarrassed. The adults gathered around Seymour, one after another. They bowed their flowing forms, not dramatically, simply, respectfully. Seymour smiled. You would have done the same for me." The Guardians responded with another graceful dance. Seymour watched them carefully. He realized that the relationship between them had changed. He was no longer simply the human who brought clams from the surface. He was part of their world, a trusted friend, and that trust would soon be tested. But Seymour did not yet know that something was waiting beyond the sanctuary, something that would force him to decide just how much he was willing to protect. Because sometimes, finding a secret is easy. Keeping it safe is the real adventure. Later that day, the lead guardian guided Seymour somewhere he had never visited before. Beyond the sanctuary stretched a narrow underwater passage hidden between towering cliffs. Only a faint current flowed through it. The opening was so well concealed that Seymour doubted any diver could accidentally discover it. The passage eventually opened into a breathtaking underwater valley. Fields of glowing sea plants covered the ocean floor like rolling meadows. Tiny fish shimmered like moving stars. Colorful jellyfish drifted peacefully overhead. Gentle sea turtles rested among smooth stone arches. Everything seemed untouched, undisturbed, perfectly balanced. The Guardians spread throughout the valley. Some gathered glowing fruit, like pods from strange underwater plants. Others tended coral formations with incredible care, gently removing drifting debris and placing broken pieces where they could continue growing. Seymour watched in fascination. They are gardeners. The realization made him smile. The Guardians were not merely living within the ocean. They were caring for it, protecting it, helping it flourish. He suddenly understood why fish were always plentiful around Merrow Bay, why the reefs remained healthy, why storms rarely damaged the coastline as severely as neighboring villages. The Guardians quietly maintained harmony beneath the waves, generation after generation, without asking for thanks, without expecting recognition. Seymour slowly looked around the underwater valley. This was not simply a hidden home. It was an ecosystem, a living sanctuary, a place that had survived because the world above had never found it. And now Seymour understood why keeping the location secret mattered so much. Back on land, Professor Edwin Thorne had reached a conclusion of his own. After weeks of observing Seymour, interviewing villagers, and studying local history, he visited Miriam at the lighthouse. "I believe the stories are true." Miriam smiled knowingly. "I thought you might. I do not know exactly what Seymour has found." He looked toward the sea. "But I know one thing. He is protecting something." Miriam nodded. "And..." Professor Thorne folded his notebook shut. "I intend to help him." Unfortunately, not everyone shared the professor's intentions. The two businessmen had quietly returned to the mainland several days earlier. Now, they came back, this time with 3 additional boats. They anchored just outside Merrow Bay, explaining to curious villagers that they were conducting a survey for valuable shell beds. The explanation sounded reasonable. Even Seymour could not object without revealing more than he wished. But deep inside, he knew the truth. They were searching. That evening, Seymour dove into the sanctuary. Before he could even greet the Guardians, he noticed something alarming. The ancient crystal was glowing rapidly. Pulse after pulse of blue light echoed throughout the sanctuary. The Guardians moved swiftly, not chaotically, purposefully. Groups gathered near different passages leading away from the sanctuary. Others guided the youngest guardians toward protected chambers deeper within the cliffs. The lead guardian approached Seymour immediately. It placed one flowing arm against the glowing crystal. Another vision appeared. Seymour saw the survey boats drifting above the sanctuary, heavy metal anchors scraping across the ocean floor, long measuring cables descending into the water. None of the people aboard knew the sanctuary lay below. But if they continued, sooner or later, they would find it. The vision faded. Seymour looked at the lead guardian. "I will not let them." The guardian remained beside him. For a moment, neither moved. Then the ancient crystal gave one slow pulse of light. Seymour understood. The guardians were trusting him to help. Real quick, if you're enjoying this story so far, please leave a like and comments down below. Would you have kept the guardians secret if you had discovered them? Or would you have told the world about such an incredible discovery? I would love to know what you would have chosen. Now, let's get back into the story. The next morning, before sunrise, Seymour visited Professor Thorne. "I need your help." The professor looked up from his notes. "You finally decided to ask." Seymour smiled slightly. "I cannot explain everything. You do not have to. But I need those survey boats gone." Professor Thorne thought for a moment. Then a grin slowly spread across his face. "I think I have an idea." By midday, nearly the entire village had gathered near the docks. Professor Thorne addressed the survey team politely. "As a marine researcher, I would love to review your permits." The businessmen exchanged confused glances. "Our permits? Certainly." Professor Thorne smiled warmly. Any extended marine survey this close to protected fishing grounds should have documentation. The tallest businessman hesitated. We left it on the mainland." "I see." Professor Thorne's smile never faded. "Then perhaps you should retrieve it." Several local fishermen stepped closer. Not aggressively, simply curious. One elderly fisherman crossed his arms. "We have never had anyone surveying our waters before." Another nodded. "Seems fair to show the paperwork." More villagers joined the conversation. Questions multiplied. The businessmen grew increasingly uncomfortable. None of them wished to attract unnecessary attention, especially if they lacked proper authorization. After a tense discussion, the survey boats quietly departed. The villagers waved politely as they disappeared over the horizon. Only Seymour and Professor Thorne exchanged relieved smiles. That evening, Seymour returned to the sanctuary. The ancient crystal glowed softly once again. Calmly, peacefully, the youngest guardians emerged from their hiding places. Soon the sanctuary was once again filled with graceful dances. The lead guardian drifted towards Seymour. It paused, then slowly touched the carved pendant hanging around his neck. The stone separated into two identical pieces. One remained around Seymour's neck. The other floated gently into his hand. Seymour stared in surprise. The guardian looked toward the surface, then back toward Seymour. Understanding slowly dawned. This is not for me. The guardian performed its graceful zigzag dance. Seymour smiled. It is for someone else. Immediately, Professor Thorne came to mind. A man who had protected a secret he had never even seen. A man who chose respect over curiosity. A man who had earned trust. Perhaps The Guardians had noticed. Perhaps they were making a choice of their own. As Seymour prepared to leave the sanctuary, he looked back one final time. Thousands of transparent Guardians danced beneath the glowing light of the ancient crystal. No longer simply surviving. They were beginning to hope again. And for the first time in countless generations, the future no longer seemed uncertain. Because trust, like the tide, could spread farther than anyone imagined. All it needed was someone willing to protect it. And tomorrow, Seymour would discover whether the Guardians were finally ready to trust another human. The morning air carried the scent of salt and blooming wildflowers as Seymour stood at the end of the pier. The sun had only begun to rise, painting the horizon with shades of gold and soft orange. In his hand rested the second carved pendant. It looked identical to the one hanging around his own neck. Smooth, round, decorated with graceful swirling patterns that resembled the movement of ocean currents. Seymour turned it over carefully. The Guardians had trusted him with many gifts. Pearls, friendship, their hidden sanctuary. But this was different. This was trust meant for someone else. Later that morning, Seymour climbed the winding path toward the old lighthouse. Professor Edwin Thorne was already outside, carefully recording seabird migrations in a small notebook. When he noticed Seymour approaching, he smiled. "You look as though you have made an important decision." "I think," Seymour replied, "it was not my decision to make." Professor Thorne looked puzzled. Seymour opened his hand. Resting in his palm was the carved pendant. "I would like you to have this." The professor blinked. "It is beautiful. It was given to me." "For me?" Seymour nodded. "I believe so." Professor Thorne accepted the pendant with great care. He did not ask where it came from. He did not ask what it meant. Instead, he simply placed it around his neck. "Thank you." Seymour smiled. "I have one question. What is it? If you discovered something extraordinary." Professor Thorne looked toward the sea. "Would you tell the whole world?" The professor was quiet for a long time. Finally, he answered, "Only if the discovery wished to be found." Seymour's smile widened. It was exactly the answer he had hoped for. The following morning, for the first time, Seymour was not alone as he sailed away from Marrow Bay. Professor Thorne sat quietly beside him. Neither man spoke very much. There was no excitement, no rush, only respect. When they reached the familiar waters, Seymour looked toward the professor. "Whatever happens, we accept it." Professor Thorne nodded. "If they do not appear, we leave. And if they do, we thank them." Seymour smiled. Together, they entered the sea. The descent felt strangely peaceful. Schools of colorful fish surrounded them as beams of sunlight reached through the crystal-clear water. Seymour led the way. Professor Thorne followed several feet behind. At first, nothing happened. The ocean remained silent. Professor Thorne simply admired the coral reefs surrounding them. Then, a small transparent figure peeked from behind a coral formation. Another followed, then another. Professor Thorne froze. His eyes widened behind his diving mask. The impossible creatures slowly drifted into view. Not hiding, not fleeing, watching, curious. One tiny guardian cautiously approached the professor. It stopped just beyond his outstretched hand. Professor Thorne remembered Seymour's advice. Let them choose. So, he remained perfectly still. The tiny guardian slowly circled him. Then, it gently touched the carved pendant. The pendant glowed. Immediately, the little guardian began its familiar zigzag dance. The others joined. Within moments, dozens of transparent guardians filled the surrounding water. Professor Thorne could not stop smiling. Even through his diving mask, Seymour could see tears forming in the corners of the professor's eyes. Not tears of fear, tears of gratitude. The Guardians had accepted him. Together, Seymour and Professor Thorne followed the Guardians to the ancient sanctuary. This time, the massive stone gateway opened before either man touched it, as though the sanctuary itself recognized a trusted guest. Professor Thorne entered slowly. The moment he saw the hidden city, he stopped swimming altogether. Thousands of Guardians drifted peacefully through glowing coral gardens. The ancient crystal shone from the sanctuary center. Young Guardians laughed silently as they played among colorful fish. Everywhere he looked, life flourished. Professor Thorne quietly removed the waterproof notebook from his equipment. He stared at it for a moment. Then, he gently placed it back into his pocket. Seymour looked at him curiously. Aren't you going to write? Professor Thorne smiled. Some places, he looked around the sanctuary, deserve to be remembered, but not recorded. Seymour nodded. The Guardians seemed to understand. Their dances became brighter, vaster. The sanctuary filled with graceful spirals of transparent light. Over the following months, life in Merrow Bay quietly changed. Not because the sanctuary became famous, because it did not. The Guardians remained hidden. Only Seymour, Professor Thorne, and Miriam knew the truth. Together, they agreed on one simple promise. The sanctuary would remain a secret. Not forever, only until humanity learned to value wonder more than ownership. Professor Thorne published a different kind of book. Instead of revealing locations, he wrote about the importance of protecting oceans, about respecting marine life, about preserving habitats before they disappeared. The book inspired countless readers to care for the sea. No one realized that every chapter had been inspired by the hidden Guardians beneath Merrow Bay. Seymour continued fishing, just as he always had. He harvested only what he needed. He never took more than the ocean could give. Other fishermen slowly noticed his habits, without realizing why. Many began doing the same. Fish populations around Merrow Bay steadily increased. Coral reefs became healthier. Sea turtles returned to nest along nearby beaches. Even whales occasionally appeared offshore during their migrations. Visitors praised the village for its beautiful waters. The villagers simply smiled. They believed they had been fortunate. Only Seymour knew. Someone else had been helping. Years passed. Children who had once played along the docks grew into fishermen of their own. Many sought Seymour's advice. He never spoke about hidden sanctuaries or transparent guardians. Instead, he always gave them the same lesson. The sea is not ours. He would smile. We are only visitors. If you treat it with kindness, it will take care of you. Those words became something of a tradition in Merrow Bay. Each new fisherman heard them before their first voyage. Generation after generation. One calm evening, long after the market had closed. An older Seymour sailed alone toward the horizon. The sea was perfectly still. The sunset painted the water with brilliant shades of orange and violet. As he drifted peacefully, tiny ripples appeared beside his boat. One, then another, then dozens. Transparent guardians emerged around the vessel. Some were familiar, others were new. Several young guardians, now fully grown, performed joyful zigzag dances around the boat. The laid guardian approached. Though older than when Seymour had first met it, its graceful movements remained unchanged. It gently touched the side of the boat. The water shimmered. The familiar warmth spread through Seymour's heart. He smiled. "My old friends." The guardian drifted closer. For several quiet moments, neither moved, neither needed words. The ocean itself spoke through gentle waves, through dancing currents, through peaceful silence. As darkness slowly settled across the sea, thousands of tiny blue lights appeared beneath the water. The entire sanctuary seemed to glow far below the surface. It looked like a second sky, a sky beneath the ocean. Seymour removed his hat, placed it over his heart. "Thank you." The guardians answered with one final dance. Their graceful zigzag movements flowed together into beautiful spirals that shimmered beneath the moonlight before slowly disappearing into the deep. Years later, visitors to Merrow Bay occasionally asked why its waters were so remarkably clear, why the fish was so plentiful, why dolphins always seemed unusually playful near the harbor. The villagers would simply smile. "We have always respected the sea." No one knew how true those words really were. Far beneath the waves, beyond the coral forests, past the ancient stone gateway, the hidden sanctuary continued to thrive. The crystals still glowed with the steady heartbeat of the ocean. Young guardians still danced through fields of glowing sea plants. New generations were born. Old stories were remembered. And whenever someone approached the sea with genuine kindness, the guardians quietly watched, waiting, not for someone seeking riches, not for someone searching for fame, but for someone whose heart reflected the rhythm of the ocean itself. Because the greatest treasures in the world are not the ones we possess. They are the ones we choose to protect. And somewhere, beneath the endless blue, the guardians still danced, waiting patiently for the next friend. This concludes The Fisherman and the Hidden Sea.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe to tune back in next week, where more stories and continuations will be added. Remember, every story begins with a dream and grows from an imagination. Dream beautifully, everyone.